He was standing there holding the silver tray he had knocked down. He placed it on the table without looking at me. "Get new medication," he said. I looked at the tray. It was the closest thing to an apology I would ever get from a man like him. I nodded. I would return in 5 minutes. When I stepped out, I allowed myself to smile. Not because I had won, but because I realized that beneath the devil's armor, there was still a man capable of feeling. The infection was deep, but the man was still there. And for a woman with duct-taped shoes and a hollow heart, that was enough of a reason to stay for another week. On the 5th night, everything changed. I was lying on my bed in that small room, staring at a crack in the ceiling that looked like the map of a country I never wanted to visit. At 1 o'clock in the morning, a sound drifted down the hallway, not the sharp ping of the call bell, but a low, guttural moaning. It was the sound of something striking against heavy mahogany furniture and fragmented, incoherent speech. I jumped up, not even bothering to throw on a sweater over my thin camisole, and ran toward Dae-hyun's room. Because I knew that sound. It was the sound of a soul trying to exit a body that wasn't finished with it yet. I pushed the door open, and the sight froze the blood in my veins. Dae-hyun was on the floor, his right leg tangled in the heavy silk sheets as if he'd tried to stand and the world had tilted on its axis. Sweat soaked through his black shirt, making the fabric cling to his ribs like a second, bruised skin. His eyes were wide, blacker than the room, but they were seeing things I couldn't. He was delirious. I rushed to him, my knees hitting the floor with a dull thud, and pressed my palm against his forehead. His skin burned like a hot coal left in the rain. I estimated at least 40 degrees Celsius, maybe more. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a frantic bird in a wicker cage. I called his name, but he didn't hear me. Instead, he began to speak in broken, indistinct phrases, and then he breathed a name. Luca, he kept calling for Luca. His voice was trembling with a raw, jagged pain that made my own chest ache. "I am sorry, Luca."
He was sorry.
"Please do not go. Please do not leave." I didn't know who Luca was, but I knew that specific frequency of grief. It was the same sound I'd made when Marcus's hand went cold in mine. There was no time for questions. I ran to the bathroom, grabbed heavy towels, and soaked them in ice water until my own fingers went numb. I began cooling his neck and the pulse points at his wrists. I called Dr. Tommy Chun, the only man allowed in this fortress, and he arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag clicking as he set it down. Tommy administered high-dose antibiotics and a fever reducer through an 4-line, his movements precise and mechanical. He looked at the wound. The edges were angry, weeping a yellowish fluid that smelled of rot and neglected pride. Tommy said the wound was far more severely infected than he had thought, and that if Dae-hyun continued to refuse proper treatment, he would not survive the month. I asked why he was doing this to himself. Tommy went silent, his hands steady as he titrated the drip. It was not his story to tell, but that it involved Luca, Dae-hyun's younger brother and also Tommy's closest friend. Luca had died 3 years earlier, and Dae-hyun had never forgiven himself. Tommy left at 4 o'clock in the morning once the fever had dropped to 38 degrees. I pulled a chair to the bedside and sat. The room was silent except for the rhythmic hiss of the fire dying in the grate. Dae-hyun remained unconscious, his face finally softening in the shadows. Without the mask of the monster, he looked exhausted, a man who had carried the world on his back until his spine snapped. Suddenly, his hand reached out and closed around mine. I startled, but I didn't pull away. His grip was hot and desperate, like a drowning man catching a piece of driftwood. He called Luca's name again. "Do not go. I am sorry. I should have saved you. I didn't know the story, but I knew the weight." I tightened my grip, my fingers interlacing with his. I spoke softly into the dark, telling him I was here. Telling him he wasn't alone. I stayed there all night, my hand never leaving his, my eyes never leaving his face, as the fever finally broke into a cold sweat. I didn't notice when I slumped forward, my head resting against the edge of the mattress. And when Dae-hyun woke at the first pale light of dawn slipping through the curtains, the first thing he saw was me. Asleep beside his bed, my hair a mess, my small hand still holding his, as if I were the one afraid of him disappearing.
He watched me for a long time.
He didn't pull his hand away. For the first time in 3 years, the devil let someone stay. I woke with a neck that felt like it had been twisted by an angry ogre. I snapped upright, realizing I was still by his bed. Dae-hyun was watching me, his eyes fully awake and terrifyingly lucid.
I didn't know how long he'd been staring.
I pulled my hand free, the skin where we'd touched feeling strangely cold now. I stammered an apology, saying I hadn't meant to fall asleep. My heart was doing a frantic dance in my throat. I grabbed the thermometer, checking his stats. 375. Better. I began the morning ritual, cleaning the wound with saline and a steady hand. The infection was retreating, but the silence between us was growing. As I packed my kit, his voice cracked the quiet. He asked whether she had sat there all night. I nodded without looking up. He paused, then asked why. Why she stayed, why she held his hand. He had not paid her to do those things. I turned to face him then. In his eyes, there wasn't the usual ice. There was a genuine, terrifying confusion. He didn't understand kindness without a price tag. He had been calling someone's name in his delirium, and she could not leave when someone was in that much pain, I said. He turned his face toward the window. Luca, he whispered. I asked who he was. Dae-hyun's voice was flat, like a calm sea before a storm. Luca was his younger brother. Luca was dead, and it was his fault.
He didn't cry.
Men like him don't have tears. They have lead in their veins. I sat down and told him about Marcus. I told him that facts aren't the same as feelings. Marcus had forgiven her before he took his last breath. But she had never been able to forgive herself. Keeping someone alive when they wanted to go wasn't an act of heroism. It was an act of selfish desperation. I told him I knew what it felt like to look in the mirror and see a killer. We sat there, two people whose lives had been broken by love and pride, and for a moment, the mansion felt less like a prison and more like a sanctuary. He didn't offer comfort. He just nodded, a slow, heavy movement. He understood. I stood up to get his breakfast, and as I reached the door, he called my name.
Thank you, he said.
2 words. They sounded like a mountain moving. I smiled, a real one this time, and stepped out. My heart was racing for a reason that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the way he'd looked at me, as if I were the only thing in the world that made sense. The second week brought the storm. Her name was Natasha Volov. She burst into the room without a knock, a tall woman with hair the color of expensive champagne and eyes that could freeze the sun. 2 massive bodyguards trailed her, with Ji-hoon looking like he wanted to snap their necks for the intrusion. She sat in the chair opposite Dae-hyun, as if she owned the air he breathed. She was the daughter of a Russian associate, here to discuss a proposal that smelled like a threat. I stood by the table, my medical kit in hand, feeling like a shadow. Natasha looked at me as if I were a stain on the carpet. "What is this?" she asked, her voice like a velvet whip. I didn't wait for Dae-hyun to answer. "I am Mr. Kang's nurse, and I am doing my job." So, if Ms. Volov did not mind, she needed to change the patient's bandages, Natasha scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Oh, it talks," she turned back to Dae-hyun. "Since when did he allow servants to speak when guests were present?" Heat rushed to my face. "I am a nurse. I am a professional. I am not a servant." I told her that she was medical staff, and whether Miss Volkov was a Russian princess or the Queen of Hell, she would still do her job. Natasha sprang to her feet, her blue eyes blazing. She stepped close, her perfume a cloying, chemical floral scent. She told me I didn't know who I was talking to. She said people like me didn't get to look people like her in the eye. Dae-hyun's voice cut through the air like a gunshot. "Sit down and let her work." Natasha froze. She couldn't believe it. But she sat. I changed the bandages, my hands steady, while I felt her gaze burning a hole in my back. When I left, I heard her speak in Russian, a low, rhythmic threat. I didn't need a translator to know I had just made an enemy who didn't take no for an answer. 3 nights later, the darkness in Dae-hyun's soul spilled over again. I found him by the fireplace, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and the scent of regret.
It was Luca's birthday. He told me the whole story.
How Luca wanted to be a doctor, to be different from the family business. How he'd been kidnapped by a rival gang. They demanded that he withdraw from 3 Brooklyn districts and pay a $5 million ransom. Dae-hyun could have paid. But he was the leader. He had to think of the bigger picture. He refused to negotiate, believing he was smarter, believing he could rescue Luca his own way. He was wrong. A wooden crate was delivered to his door. Inside was Luca. He hurled a bottle into the fire, the glass shattering with a sound like a scream. He had killed his brother. His arrogance had done it. He chose pride over his brother's life. I sat with him while the fire died. I told him death wasn't atonement. It was an escape. If he died, the pain would not disappear. It would simply pass to others. He looked at me, then reached out and brushed a tear from my cheek. It was a brief touch, but it felt like a vow. That night, he didn't sleep alone in the dark. I stayed until the sun started to bleach the sky. The 3rd week brought my own ghost. My mother, Sarah Bennett, appeared at the gate. She looked like a faded version of the woman who had abandoned me 19 years ago, smelling of cheap gin and desperation. She didn't want a daughter. She wanted $50,000 to pay off her gambling debts. She threatened to go to the press, to tell the world about the poor nurse living with a mafia boss. I felt small, a child again, waiting for the blow. But then Dae-hyun was there. He stood in the doorway, his presence an absolute weight. He told her I was under his protection. He told her she had 30 seconds to leave before the people she owed found her. He called me his after she fled. I broke. The years of being strong, of being the one who survived, they just crumbled. I cried in that silent room, and Dae-hyun sat with me. He didn't have soft words, but he had a steady shoulder. He told me humans always hope, even when they know it will hurt. He said that was what separated us from monsters. And for the first time, the distance between us vanished. We were just 2 people trying to stay afloat in a very deep sea. The attack happened when I went to pick up his meds. I thought I was safe. I thought the daylight would protect me. 2 men cornered me in an alley. Natasha's regards. I fought. I kicked, I swung my bag, I used a piece of broken glass. I had lived in Lagos. I knew how to fight for my life. But they were too many. A man raised his fist, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the dark. Instead, I heard the snap of bone. Marco was there. He was a whirlwind of professional violence. He brought me back to the estate, blood dripping from my lip, my green scrubs torn. When Dae-hyun saw me, the air in the room seemed to vanish.
He didn't yell.
He just took me from Marco, his touch impossibly gentle. He made a call to Natasha's father. His daughter had laid hands on someone who belonged to him. If it happened again, the alliance would end along with Natasha's life. Later in my room, he told me he didn't know how to love.
He didn't know if he had the right.
But he knew that when I was hurt, his heart ached, as if the knife had gone into him.
He asked me to stay.
Not as his nurse, but as Grace. I looked at him, this man who was my devil and my sanctuary, and I said yes. A year later, the Luca Kong Clinic opened its doors in the Bronx. It was a lighthouse of glass and steel. I stood on the stage, pregnant with our first child, my hand in Dae-hyun's. He had moved the business into the light, away from the blood of the past. When it was my turn to speak, the world tilted. I swayed, and he caught me, his face pale with fear. Tommy laughed when he realized the truth. "You are going to be a father," I told him. The great Dae-hyun Kong, the man who had faced armies without blinking, stared at me, his mouth open, and then he simply fainted. The room erupted in laughter. As I patted his cheek to wake him up, I realized the debt was paid. Not with money, but with a life. Our story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a reclamation. We had both been discarded, but together, we were whole. The devil had found his heart, and the poor nurse had finally found her home. And that, I realized as he opened his eyes and smiled at me, was the only rule that mattered.